Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we are looking at John Irenicus Shattered One. So John is a 4 mana black and blue commander. He's a 3/3 elf wizard, and he says, at the beginning of your end step, target opponent gains control of up to one target creature you control, put 2+1/+1 counters on it and tap it. It's goaded for the rest of the game, and it gains this creature can't be sacrificed. So goaded means it attacks each combat if able and attacks a player other than you if able. And finally, whenever a creature you own but don't control attacks, you draw a card. So there's obviously a lot of different things going on with this commander. You are donating your creatures to your opponents. They are getting bigger because you are putting +1 counters on them. You are making it so that those creatures have to attack and have to attack someone who isn't you. You are making them unable to sacrifice those creatures. And finally, it is making it so that when those creatures attack, you get to draw a card. So clearly, the best strategy to employ with John is that you're going to donate detrimental creatures to your opponents. Creatures that make them sacrifice their own permanents, creatures that make them discard, creatures that make them lose life, etc. And then while those creatures are being detrimental to them, they are simultaneously attacking your other opponents and drawing you cards when they attack. So in that regard, John is very similar to other commanders like Zedru and Blim, where you are donating what I'll call hot potatoes over to your opponent. So obviously, there's going to be a lot of different cards in the deck, but the most fun things to go over are obviously going to be the hot potatoes. And these are going to break into two different categories. There are the cheap creatures that are unblockable, which you are using to basically just make it so that your opponents are constantly attacking each other in a way that they can't block, that will damage each other over time, and of course, let you keep drawing cards. And then there are the actual hot potatoes that have severely detrimental effects for the opponent. So the first one, let's cover the unblockable creatures. So this is going to be fairly obvious. There's Baleful Strix. You get to draw a card when it enters, and then flying doesn't mean that it's straight up unblockable, but it's close enough, and you at least got to draw a card when it entered the battlefield. And then the rest of them, although there are creatures at 2 mana that are unblockable, I've found that I probably just want the 1-drops, so regardless of what they are, that are unblockable. So these are Changeling Outcast, Gadul Lurker, Mistcloaked Herald, Slitherblade, Tormented Soul, and Triton Shorestalker. Again, obviously there's many more you could play. I figured the ones that only cost 1 mana would be better. Then you have your hot potato creatures, your severely detrimental effect creatures. So the ones I've chosen here are Demonic Taskmaster. At the beginning of your upkeep, sack a creature other than Demonic Taskmaster. Desecration Elemental, fear, and whenever a player casts a spell, sacrifice a creature. Remember that part of John's ability is that the creature cannot be sacrificed, so the Desecration Elemental can't just be sacrificed to its own trigger. Ebon Drake, whenever a player casts a spell, you lose 1 life. Ebon Blade Reaper. This is a creature that, morph aside, has the more relevant ability of whenever it attacks, you lose half your life rounded up. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life rounded up. So this creature doesn't have flying or any sort of unblockability clause. So the most likely scenario is that you donate it to an opponent, it attacks once, and then the player who it's attacking is probably going to want to block this, so it'll just die. So the real question is, under the minimum, floor power level, are you willing to spend 3 mana to draw a card and have one of your opponents lose southwards of 20 life? There's Phyrexian Negator. Whenever it's dealt damage, sack that many permanents. So either your opponent doesn't block it and takes 7 damage at a time, because remember, John puts 2+1 counters on the creature, or they do block it, and then the player who controls Negator has to sacrifice X many permanents, where X is however much damage Negator took. And of course, again, remember, the Phyrexian Negator cannot be sacrificed due to John's ability. There's Rotting Regisaur. At the beginning of your upkeep, discard a card. Rust Elemental. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice an artifact other than Rust Elemental, and if you can't, tap it and you lose 4. So you're going to wind up losing all of the other artifacts you have, probably your mana rocks and whatnot, and then eventually it'll start tapping and losing 4. Serendib Djinn. So this is obviously templated in a very old manner, but basically it just causes you to have to sacrifice a land every turn. Steel Golem. Again, the text is outdated, but this essentially just says you can't cast creatures. Taniwa has Phasing Trample, and at the beginning of your upkeep, all lands you control phase out. So what's going to happen with this one is on the first upkeep, it's going to cause the lands to phase out and itself. Then next turn, it will phase back in along with your other lands, and then alternatively phase out and have your lands phase out again. So it basically means every other turn, whoever you donated this to cannot use their lands outside of their upkeep. There's Thought Devourer. Your maximum hand size is reduced by 4, so it's reduced to only 3 cards. And similarly, Thought Eater, it's reduced by 3, so it's reduced to 4 cards. And then finally, Wretched Anurid. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you lose 1 life. So the benefit of the lower cost cards is that you can cast them after playing John and hold up mana for counter spells or just other forms of interaction or to protect John. Because remember, this deck revolves around John Irenicus, so you want to make sure it doesn't get countered or killed. So if the card is more expensive, like a Taniwa, for example, and is potentially going to make you have to tap out for it, you want to make sure that the effect you're getting is really, really good. Aside from all that, to go through the rest of the cards, it's pretty much what you would expect in the blue-black commander decks. So things like Dress Down, Bolas' Citadel, Necropotence. Sig River Cutthroat is particularly good here because you're donating a bunch of base power 1 creatures to your opponents, which are then getting 2/1 counters and are unblockable. So as long as those creatures are hitting your opponents, somebody is going to be losing 3 life a turn, and then you'll get to draw cards off of Sig. Obviously, Console Oracle. Cut this away if you're not interested in a CDH power level deck. Whole bunch of counter spells. We need to keep John alive. Pretty straightforward mana base. Nothing really to see here. A little bit of extra protection apart from the counter spells, so things like Lightning Greaves, Slip Out the Back, Spellskite, Turn Aside, and Intervene. Little bit of ramp. It's possible that you might want more ramp than this, in which case you'd have to include additional colorless adding mana rocks. Right now it's 11, which is a little bit on the low side, but I think it's still enough. For removal, we've got obviously Dress Down as mentioned earlier. There's also Deadly Rollick, Gilded Drake, Bowmaster, Zotawara, and Snap. It is also important to take note that for any bounce spells, you can bounce creatures that you've donated. You may also wind up in situations where one of 2 other things happens. Either you play a creature that has a detrimental effect that you want to donate and they kill John or counter John before you're able to donate that creature. Or in the event that you have a player who you've donated to lose the game, all of the donated creatures that you've given to them will revert back to your control, which obviously is a problem if John can't donate them immediately away. So you can have some bounce spells to bounce them back to your hand. A little stacks, Dothy, Orcish, Sheoldred, and sweepers in Cyclonic Rift, Toxic Deluge, and then as mentioned earlier, in regards to bouncing, there is Raise the Palisade. Choose a creature type, return all creatures that aren't of the chosen type to their owner's hand. So if you have a bunch of creatures that you wanted to donate that then get reverted back to your control because the player lost the game, you can just choose Elf or Wizard, since John is an Elf Wizard, and then bounce all of the other creatures back to your hand. And it's important to note that for all the creatures in the deck, the only creature that has a type that overlaps with John is Thassa's Oracle being a wizard. So pretty much just choose Elf or Wizard and you should be good. And then finally, obviously, some tutors because, you know, we're playing EDH, we're playing blue-black, we're going to be playing tutors. Now, aside from all of that, there were a bunch of cards that I considered for the deck and ultimately decided to cut, either because they weren't good enough, or they weren't as good as other things we could be playing, or we just literally needed the space. So a bunch of those were donation cards that I ultimately decided to cut. So Dimir Infiltrator, I felt like was the best unblockable 2-drop next to Baleful Strix, but ultimately I decided that aside from Baleful Strix, I didn't want any of the unblockable creatures at 2 mana. We just didn't need them with all of the other 1-drops we had. And also the same was the case for Invisible Stalker. I don't really care if my opponents are pointing removal spells at the unblockable creatures, that's fine. Then there's cards like Puka's Mischief, which is one of many cards that are able to donate permanents. So the idea here would be that if John is dealt with, you have another method of donating the permanents. The issue I had here is, one, just none of them are as good as John himself. So I really don't think you can get around the fact that the deck basically breaks down if you don't get John onto the board, or if he gets killed or countered. The second thing is that even amongst the donation cards, Puka's Mischief being the best one, they do not include John's other qualifiers on the cards that you're donating. You don't give them the +1 counters, and more importantly, you don't goad them, and you don't get to draw cards when they attack. So I felt like there just really wasn't any good replacement for John, and the deck really needs to just be built around the premise that John is going to stick on the board, and if it doesn't, well, you're kind of out of luck. And then the rest of the cards were detrimental creature abilities, most of which I cut because of mana value. So things like Archfiend of the Dross, Greater Harvester, which makes you have to sack permanents, Gut Wrencher Oni, which makes you have to discard, Shadowborn Demon, which makes you have to sack creatures, and Yukora the Prisoner, which makes you have to sack creatures when it leaves the battlefield. There's also Drinker of Sorrow. When it deals combat damage, sack a permanent. This was the cheapest one that I cut, which I just cut for space, so it's possible that this can come back. Grid Monitor has the same ability as Steel Golem, but it's 1 mana more expensive. I also don't think that that ability is terribly useful, so I did cut this for space. And then finally, Asmodeus the Archfiend. So the idea here is that you would donate it, and it says if you would draw a card, you would instead exile the top card of your library face down, and you've got to pay black mana in order to get those cards back. So the idea here would be that you would donate it to an opponent that can't produce black mana, and then they basically can't draw cards for the rest of the game. The reason I cut it was twofold. The first is how expensive it is. At 6 mana, it's probably unlikely that you'll be able to play this and hold up mana for anything else. The second issue is that an opponent not having black mana is completely out of your control, and even if there is a player in the pod who is in a black deck, that doesn't mean that they necessarily can't produce black mana. If they're running a card like City of Brass, Mana Confluence, Felwar Stone, there's plenty of mana-adding lands and mana rocks that have the ability to add rainbow mana, so you're not necessarily even guaranteed to lock them out with this, but in the end, the main problem was the 6 mana cost. I also opted not to run Ritual or Jeweled Lotus to get John out faster, because you still need the mana to play what are often some of these more expensive detrimental creatures anyway, and you still need the mana to protect him. So I ultimately opted not for them, although there is obviously an argument for being able to Ritual or Jeweled Lotus out John while holding up mana for counterspells. And then I cut things like Whelming Wave. I felt like Raising Palisade was enough, but if you want more bounce spells, you could play Whelming Wave. However, it is notable that some of the donation creatures do fall into these creature types, so you wouldn't be able to bounce them back. Those are the primary cards that I opted not to play. Imperial Seal and Submerge were just a few others, which you could obviously add back into the deck if you decide that these numbers need a little tweaking. So with that said, that is John Irenicus Shattered One for EDH.